The rain was a relentless, drumming curtain on the tarmac, turning the world into a smear of gray and dull orange runway lights. Inside the cavernous belly of the C-130 Hercules, the air was thick with the smell of wet gear and cold frustration. Captain Eva Rostova stood motionless, a statue amidst the controlled chaos of her team packing away the mission. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the edge of a metal crate. The words from command echoed in her skull, sterile and final. Operation Nightingale is scrubbed. Weather is 0. Extraction is impossible. Each word was a nail in a coffin. The high-value target, a virologist with data on a weaponized pathogen, would be executed at dawn. The intelligence was clear, the window was closed. But Eva had seen the other file, the one buried in the appendices. Their source, a woman, a nurse named Anahita. Her last transmission was not just data, it was a voice cracking with static and fear, a promise of safety in exchange for salvation. Failure was not just a tactical setback, it was a death sentence for the woman who trusted them. Sergeant Miller, her XO, moved beside her, his face a hard mask of professional acceptance. "It's done, Cap. Command made the call. The asset is written off." He didn't say Anahita's name. Assets were faceless, disposable. Eva's eyes remained fixed on the dark expanse of the airfield beyond the ramp. "They're not just assets, Miller. She's a person." Miller let out a slow breath, his voice dropping, meant only for her. "I know what you're thinking. Don't. It's a suicide run. The mountains are a blender right now. It's not a mission, it's a tomb." He placed a firm hand on her arm, a gesture meant to anchor her, to pull her back from the ledge she was mentally standing on. She finally turned her head, meeting his gaze. Her eyes, a stormy gray-green, held no anger, only a terrifying, absolute resolve. It was a look that silenced his next argument. He saw the ghost of a memory there, a personal demon he couldn't fight. The trucks arrived, engines grumbling. Her team, a mix of Air Force Special Tactics and Army Rangers, loaded the last of the crates, their movements sluggish with defeat. They avoided her eyes. She was their commander, but in this moment, she was an island. One by one, they filed past her, climbing into the vehicles, seeking the dry, disappointing safety of the barracks. Miller was the last to go, pausing at the truck's tailgate. "Eva," he said, using her first name, a final personal plea. She didn't respond. She just gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a commander dismissing her subordinate. The truck doors slammed shut, one then another. The engines revved and the vehicles began to pull away, their red taillights bleeding into the downpour, becoming two dim, receding points of surrender, and then she was alone. The sound of the rain was everything, a cold, isolating symphony. She stood there for a full minute, the water plastering her dark hair to her scalp, soaking through her flight suit. She turned her back on the retreating lights on the safe, sanctioned path. Her eyes adjusted to the gloom, scanning the distant skeletal shapes of the auxiliary hangars. One Hangar 7 held a ghost, a decommissioned MH-6 Little Bird, a relic from an earlier war. It was her secret, her project for the long, idle months. The engineers thought it was a hobby, a pilot's quirky nostalgia. They had helped her, amused by her dedication. They didn't know she had been meticulously restoring it, not for a museum, but for a feeling, a need to have wings that answered only to her. It was her only chance. It was madness. It was the only thing left that felt like duty. Taking a deep, shuddering breath that filled her lungs with the cold, wet air. Captain Eva Rostova took her first step away from her career, away from her team, and into the storm. The memory hit her not as a gentle recollection, but as a physical blow, so vivid it momentarily muted the roar of the storm. It was the smell of lemon polish and old wood. She was 12 years old, standing in the quiet, sunlit kitchen of their Ohio home. Her mother, Major Anna Rostova, stood at the counter, not in combat fatigues, but in a simple t-shirt and jeans. In her hands, she held the gleaming silver wings of an Air Force pilot. With a soft, worn cloth, she polished them with a ritualistic care, a quiet meditation. Eva remembered the way the light caught the intricate details, the absolute silence of the moment. "The mission is everything, Eva," her mother had said, her voice calm and steady, her eyes fixed on the wings. "It's the objective, the orders, the reason we put on the uniform." Then she had looked up, her gaze locking with her daughter's, and in her eyes was a profound, heartbreaking softness. But the people, the ones we fight for, the ones we fight beside, they are why we do it. Never let the mission completely erase the people. The lesson, once a cornerstone of her belief, now felt like a cruel joke. Following the mission meant abandoning Anahita to torture and death. The people were why, but the order said the people were expendable. The contradiction was a hot, sharp pain in her chest. She pushed the memory down, burying it beneath the immediate, freezing reality. Her boots splashed through deepening puddles as she moved with a determined, steady pace away from the main complex. She was a ghost in the machine of the base, a solitary figure cutting across the empty, rain-swept taxiways. Her mind, however, was a war room, calculating vectors of betrayal and consequence. The court-martial was no longer a possibility, it was a certainty. The end of her career, the loss of her rank, her pension, her freedom. The weight of it was immense, a crushing pressure on her lungs. But then she heard it again. Not her mother's voice, but Anahita's. It was the last audio file, the one she had listened to a dozen times in the sterile intelligence booth. The woman's voice was a whisper, strained with a terror so pure it was almost tangible. "The package is ready. They speak of a dawn execution. Please, you must come. You gave your word." There was a final, shaky breath before the transmission cut into static. A promise. In the world of satellites and drone strikes, a human promise seemed a fragile, archaic thing. But for Ava, in that moment, it was the only piece of solid ground left to stand on. Hangar 7 loomed ahead, a dark, corrugated steel cavern. She used a bypass code she wasn't supposed to have, a digital skeleton key from a more clandestine part of her past. The small personnel door clicked open. Inside, the air was still and smelled of oil, fuel, and dust. And there it was. The MH-6 Little Bird. In the dim, emergency lighting, it looked less like a machine and more like a predator at rest, its sleek lines and bubble cockpit hinting at a dormant ferocity. The engineers had labeled it a lost cause, but she had seen its soul beneath the grime and non-functional parts. For months during late-night shifts and stolen weekends, she had been its confessor, its mechanic, its savior. She had argued for specific parts, calling in favors, explaining it was for historical preservation. Now her hands, cold and wet, ran over the composite skin of the helicopter. It was not a relic. It was a key. Her movements became swift, efficient, a pilot's ballet in the near darkness. She performed the pre-flight check from pure muscle memory, her fingers tracing fuel lines, checking fluid levels, connecting the auxiliary power unit. Each switch she flipped, each system that whirred to life, was another step across a line from which there was no return. She was no longer Captain Rostova, an officer in the United States Air Force. She was a woman with a helicopter and a promise, a rogue element in a calibrated war. The final step was pulling her personal go-bag from a hidden locker. It contained non-standard supplies, a private sidearm, and a bundle of untraceable currency, the kind of kit you prepared hoping you would never, ever need. Slinging it into the co-pilot's seat, she climbed into the cockpit. The familiar confines of the seat, the stick in her hand, felt more like home than the barracks ever had. She took a final deep breath, the air inside now thick with the smell of avionics and imminent action. Then she reached for the ignition. The turbine engine coughed once, sputtered, and then erupted into a deafening, defiant roar that shattered the hangar's silence. The sound was a declaration of war, not on the enemy, but on the fate that command had so calmly accepted. The mission was scrubbed, but Ava Rostova was just beginning. The little bird shuddered as it lifted into the tempest, its skids clearing the hangar door by inches. Immediately, the storm seized it, a toy in the hands of a giant. Ava's hands were a vice on the controls, her knuckles bone white, her entire body an instrument reacting to the bucking and yawing. She dropped the nose, sacrificing altitude for speed, and skimmed the deck, so low her landing lights glanced off the tops of gnarled, wind-whipped trees. The radar in the base's control tower would be painting a faint, ghostly return if they saw anything at all amidst the storm clutter. She was counting on being dismissed as an anomaly, a phantom in the rain. Her headset crackled to life, a voice tight with controlled alarm. Unidentified aircraft on taxiway Charlie, you are not cleared for departure. Acknowledge. Eva reached down, her finger hovering over the transmit button. A single word would seal her fate. She let the silence speak for her, and then she killed the transponder. On their screens, the ghost vanished entirely. She was now a true ghost, a rogue element in the night. The mountains rose before her, black teeth tearing at a bruised sky. This was the suicide run Miller had warned her about. The wind screamed through the passes, creating vortices that tried to slam her into rock faces. Icing conditions were a very real threat, the freezing rain ready to coat her rotors and turn the helicopter into a stone. She flew by instinct as much as by instrument, her eyes darting between the glowing dials and the opaque darkness beyond the windshield. Every nerve was alive, every sense heightened. The drone of the engine, the howl of the wind, the constant sharp corrections on the cyclic. It was a violent, consuming symphony. There was no room for doubt now, no room for fear of courts-martial or prison. There was only the next gust of wind, the next ridgeline, the next 5 seconds of survival. This brutal focus was a strange kind of peace. The weight of the decision was gone, replaced by the absolute physical demand of the moment. Her mind, a part not needed for flying, replayed the satellite images of the LZ. A muddy clearing, codenamed Orchard, just 2 clicks from the target village. It was tight, even for a little bird. She had memorized the approach, the escape vector, the location of a nearby stream where she could hide the helo if needed. But maps and reality were 2 different countries in a war zone. The storm was erasing her landmarks, turning the terrain into a shifting, monochromatic nightmare. She felt a sudden, violent downdraft, the helicopter dropping like an elevator. Alarms blared in the cockpit. She fought the stick, muscles straining, pouring power into the rotors, pulling up just as the treetops flashed beneath her skids. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. This was madness. Pure, unadulterated madness. But within the madness, a cold, hard certainty was forming. This was no longer just about the mission parameters, the HVT, or even her promise to Anahita. This was about the fundamental reason she had put on the uniform in the first place. It was about refusing to leave someone behind. It was about looking into the abyss of a bureaucratic decision and saying, no. The helicopter broke through a final cloud layer. And there, in a valley below, she saw the faint, scattered lights of the village. The first part of the journey was over. The real battle was about to begin. The landing was less a touchdown and more a controlled crash. The little bird's skids sank deep into the churned, soupy mud of the clearing, the aircraft listing dangerously to one side before settling with a final, shuddering groan. Eva killed the engine, and the sudden silence was as shocking as the storm had been. Now the only sounds were the relentless hiss of rain on the canopy and the frantic thumping of her own heart. She sat for a moment, listening, her senses stretching out into the oppressive darkness. No shouts, no gunfire. The storm had masked her arrival. She unstrapped herself, the harness clicking open unnaturally loud in the quiet. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as she pulled her rifle from its stowage and checked the load. The cold night air, thick with the smell of wet earth and pine, flooded the cockpit as she slid the canopy open and dropped into the knee-deep muck. She moved like a shadow, using the scant cover of stunted wind-bent trees to skirt the village's perimeter. The intelligence packet had located the HVT, Dr. Eris, in a small stone shed on the western edge. The plan was simple, a ghost extraction. Get in, secure the package, and get back to the bird. But the plan had already been scrubbed once, and Eva trusted nothing. She approached the shed from the rear, her boots making soft, sucking sounds in the mud. The door was secured with a simple, rusty padlock. A single, precise shot from her suppressed sidearm shattered the mechanism. She pushed the door open, the creak of its hinges setting her teeth on edge. Inside, a man huddled in the corner, his face pale and terrified in the beam of her red lens flashlight. "Dr. Eris? I'm Captain Rostova. I'm here to get you out." The man stared, dumbfounded, then began to babble in broken English, his relief a palpable force in the tiny space. But Eva's eyes were already scanning, her mind working. It was too easy. Far too easy. She let him out, his movements clumsy with fear. They had taken only a few steps into the concealing darkness when a figure detached itself from behind a nearby wall. Ava swung her rifle up, her finger tightening on the trigger. The figure held up empty hands. It was a young woman, her clothes soaked, her face a mask of desperation. Anahita. "They knew," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They knew you would come for him. They took him from the main house and put him here as bait. They are waiting for you at the helicopter." Eva's blood ran cold. It was an ambush. Her eyes darted back toward the orchard. Her only way out was a death trap. Anahita grabbed her arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "The commander, he took me to his compound. He asked me questions. When I did not answer, he left me. But he will be back at first light. It is 1 kilometer east. Please." The mission parameters shattered and reformed in an instant. The primary objective was compromised. The extraction point was hot. But the source, the person, was right here, begging for the promise to be kept. Dr. Aris looked between the two women, his eyes wide with a fresh wave of terror. "We must go, now!" he pleaded. Eva made a calculation, the kind they never taught in the academy. She couldn't take them both to the bird. She couldn't leave Anahita. She looked at the scientist, then at the nurse who had risked everything. "The people are why we do it." "The helicopter is compromised," Eva said, her voice low and urgent. She pointed to a dense thicket near a rocky outcrop. "Doctor, you will hide there. Do not move, do not make a sound, no matter what you hear. I will come back for you." She shoved a small locator beacon into his hand. "Activate this only if you see friendly forces. Do you understand?" The man nodded, too terrified to argue, and scrambled toward the hiding spot. Eva turned to Anahita. The mission was scrubbed a second time. A new one was just beginning. "Show me the compound," she said. The rain was their only ally, a curtain of noise and movement that masked their progress. Anahita moved with a feral grace, born of a lifetime navigating these hills. Eva followed, her combat boots finding purchase on the slick rocks with a trained silence that belied their weight. Every sense was dialed to its maximum. The compound was not a military fortification, but a warlord's nest, a cluster of low mud-brick buildings surrounded by a rough stone wall. 2 guards, huddled under a makeshift awning to escape the worst of the rain, were smoking, their rifles slung carelessly. They were complacent, confident in their trap back at the landing zone. Eva's mind worked with a cold, surgical precision. A direct assault was suicide. Stealth was the only tool she had left. She signaled to Anahita to stay put behind a large boulder, her eyes conveying a silent order. "Wait!" She circled wide, using the terrain as her shield. The mud sucked at her boots, but she moved like liquid, a dark stain against the darker earth. She approached the wall from a blind spot, away from the gate and the inattentive guards. The stones were rough and wet, offering just enough purchase. She scaled it quickly, pulling herself onto the top and dropping soundlessly into the inner courtyard. She was in. The main house was directly ahead, a single light flickering in a window. The commander was likely there, waiting for a report on the ambush he had set for her. A surge of cold anger tightened her grip on her rifle. He had used a human being as bait, and he had tortured another. This was no longer about extraction. It was about justice. She flitted from shadow to shadow, her body coiled and ready. A third guard emerged from a side building, stretching and yawning. He never saw her. One moment he was standing in the rain, the next a firm arm was locked around his neck, cutting off his air and his voice. He struggled weakly before going limp. She lowered him to the ground, quickly securing his hands and feet with zip ties and stuffing a gag in his mouth. She dragged him back into the shadows of the building he had come from. One down. She moved to the main house, pressing her back against the rough wall beside the door. She could hear voices inside, 2 men speaking in Pashto. She caught the word helicopter and waiting. They were still expecting her to walk into their trap at the LZ. Good. Let them wait. Taking a deep, silent breath, she swung around the doorframe, rifle raised. The room was Spartan, lit by a single kerosene lamp. The commander, a man with a thick black beard and cold eyes, sat at a wooden table. Another guard stood near him. The guard fumbled for his weapon. Ava's suppressed rifle coughed twice. 2 rounds hit the guard center mass. He crumpled to the floor. The commander froze, his hands flat on the table, his eyes wide with shock. He had not expected the enemy to be inside his walls. He had not expected a woman. Ava kept her rifle trained on him. "On your feet," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "You're coming with me." She needed him as a bargaining chip, a passport out of the valley. The commander slowly stood, a sly, hateful smile spreading across his face. "You are too late," he said in heavily accented English. "They are already moving to your machine. And your scientist? He will not stay hidden for long." He was trying to rattle her, to make her doubt. But Ava's focus was absolute. She gestured with the barrel of her rifle toward the door. "Move!" As the commander took a step, a burst of automatic gunfire erupted from outside the compound walls. It wasn't aimed at her. It was coming from the direction of the LZ. The ambush had been sprung on an empty helicopter. Their confusion would be short-lived. They would soon come here. Time, the one thing she never had enough of, had just run out. The gunfire from the landing zone was a gift and a curse. It confirmed the commander's story that his men were now engaged in a futile firefight with an empty helicopter, but it also meant their attention would soon turn back to the compound. The commander saw the calculation in her eyes, and his smug smile returned. "They will be here soon. You are one woman." Ava didn't answer with words. She moved forward in a blur, reversing her rifle and driving the stock into his temple with a sickening crack. His eyes rolled back and he collapsed unconscious. A bargaining chip was useless if he could scream for help. She quickly stripped him of his sidearm and radio, tossing them into a dark corner. Now she had to move. Fast. She slipped back out into the courtyard. The 2 guards under the awning were now alert, their weapons up, shouting to each other as they tried to understand the distant shooting. They were facing the wrong way. Ava took them down with 2 precise shots from the shadows. They fell without ever knowing where the threat originated. She sprinted back to the wall where she'd left Anahita. The woman's eyes were wide with terror, fixed on the direction of the gunfire. "They are shooting," she whispered. "We are trapped." "No," Eva said, her voice firm, a rock in the swirling chaos. "We're adapting. The plan has changed." She helped Anahita over the wall, the woman's body trembling with fear and cold. They had to get back to Dr. Aris. The original LZ was lost. Their only hope was the little bird itself, if it was still intact. They had to reach it before the enemy realized their mistake and doubled back. They moved through the storm-lashed darkness, a desperate trio of shadows. Ava in the lead, her rifle scanning the terrain, Anahita clinging to her webbing, and the dazed, stumbling commander dragged between them. Reaching Dr. Aris's hiding place, Ava gave a low whistle. The scientist emerged, his face a mask of pure relief. "The helicopter! We must get to the helicopter," he stammered. "They know about the helicopter," Ava said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "We're not flying out. Not yet." She looked at the unconscious commander, then at the dense forest leading up the mountain. "We need to disappear, now!" They pushed deeper into the woods, away from the village and the compromised LZ. The rain and wind were a brutal, punishing force, but it was also their shield, washing away their tracks and muffling their sounds. After 20 minutes of grueling ascent, Eva found what she was looking for, a shallow cave hidden behind a thicket of thorny bushes. It was cramped and wet, but it was defensible. She shoved the commander into the darkest corner, his hands and feet bound with zip ties from her kit. Dr. Aris collapsed against the wall, hugging his knees, his body shaking uncontrollably. Anahita sat beside him, her arm around his shoulders, offering a quiet, steadfast comfort that seemed to steady them both. Eva took up a position at the cave's entrance, her rifle resting on a rock, her eyes scanning the gray, rain-obscured landscape below. She could hear the distant, angry shouts of the search parties. They were fanning out, confused and leaderless. They knew she was here, but they didn't know where. For now, the storm and the mountains were her allies. She looked back at the 3 people in the cave. A cowardly scientist, a brave nurse, and a vicious warlord. This was not the clean surgical extraction command had planned. This was a messy, desperate, and deeply human struggle for survival. She had defied orders, destroyed her career, and plunged into certain death. And as she watched Anahita gently reassuring Dr. Aris, she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she would do it all again. The mission was scrubbed, but the promise was still alive, hiding in a cave, waiting for a dawn that would bring either salvation or a final bloody end. The night was an eternity of cold and tension. The commander regained consciousness, his muttered threats and promises of vengeance a low, grating counterpoint to the storm. Ava ignored him, her entire world narrowed to the slice of terrain visible from the cave mouth. The search parties had come close, their flashlight beams cutting through the rain just 100 meters down the slope before moving on, frustrated by the weather. As the first gray light of dawn began to bleed into the sky, the rain softened to a persistent drizzle. The storm was passing. Their cover was evaporating. Ava knew they were out of time. They had to move, and the only asset they had was the helicopter. It was a gamble of the highest order, a run directly back into the lion's den. She laid out the new desperate plan. We go back to the LZ. They've already searched it. They think we've fled into the mountains. It's the last place they'll expect us. Dr. Aris looked at her as if she were insane. They will be watching it.
It is a trap.
It was a trap, Eva corrected him, her voice calm but iron hard. Now it's our only way out. We have to get to the bird. The commander laughed, a low, ugly sound. You are a fool. My men will tear you apart. Ava turned her gaze on him, and the sheer cold fire in her eyes silenced him. She pulled him to his feet. You're our ticket through. You so much as twitch wrong, and you're the first to die. Understood? He gave a sullen nod. Their movement down the mountain was a tense, silent crawl. The world was washed clean and quiet, the only sound the dripping of water from the pine needles. They reached the tree line overlooking the orchard. The little bird sat where she had left it, looking small and vulnerable. It was surrounded by evidence of the previous night's firefight, spent shell casings glittering in the mud, but it was intact. There were no guards in immediate sight. They had, as she hoped, moved on. This was their chance. A tiny, fleeting window. They broke from the trees at a run, half dragging the commander through the mud. They were halfway to the helicopter, so close Eva could see the raindrops beaded on its canopy, when a shout erupted from the far tree line. A group of 4 fighters, returning to check the site, had spotted them. Rifle fire cracked the morning air, rounds whipping past them, kicking up fountains of mud. Go, go! Ava yelled, shoving Anahita and Dr. Aris ahead of her. She returned fire, controlled 3-round bursts that forced the enemy to take cover. It was a race against time. Anahita wrenched the cockpit open, helping the terrified scientist inside. Ava fired again, then turned to follow, dragging the commander. A searing, white-hot pain tore through her left arm. The impact spun her around, and she fell to one knee in the mud. She'd been hit. The commander saw his chance, wrestling free of her weakened grip with a triumphant snarl. He scrambled away, shouting to his men in Pashto. He was free, and he was directing their fire. They were now completely exposed. The mission, the promise. It was all about to end here, in this muddy field, under the cold, gray dawn. Eva looked at the helicopter, then at Anahita's horrified face. They were so close. She made a choice. She raised her rifle, not at the fleeing commander, but at the enemy fighters, laying down a final desperate curtain of fire. Anahita, get it started! Go! She screamed, buying them seconds with her life. The world narrowed to the crack of her rifle. The zip of incoming rounds and the sputtering, coughing sound of the little bird's engine fighting to come to life behind her. The world dissolved into a deafening roar. The little bird's turbine, fueled by Anahita's frantic efforts, screamed to life. The rotors began to turn, slowly at first, then blurring into a disk that churned the mud and rain into a filthy spray. Ava, her left arm a numb, fiery ache, kept firing. One of the enemy fighters fell, then another scrambled back for cover. But the commander was still shouting, rallying them. A round slammed into the helicopter's fuselage with a loud crack. They were out of time. A hand grabbed the back of Eva's combat harness. It was Anahita, leaning out of the cockpit, her face a mask of determination. Now, Captain, now! With a final, one-handed burst toward the tree line, Eva turned and lunged for the open cockpit. She hauled herself in, her body screaming in protest, as Anahita fell back into the co-pilot's seat. Eva's right hand found the cyclic. She pulled pitch. The overloaded little bird shuddered, its skids sucking free of the mud with a thick, wet sound. It lurched into the air, climbing sluggishly as bullets peppered the air around them. Dr. Aris was screaming, a high-pitched wail of terror. Eva ignored it all, her focus absolute. She dropped the nose, gaining speed, and skimmed the treetops, weaving violently to present a harder target. The enemy fire faded behind them, replaced by the frantic, blessed wind of their escape. They flew in stunned silence for several minutes, the only sounds the engine's whine and Aris's ragged sobs. Eva's arm throbbed with a hot, insistent pain. She glanced at Anahita, who was already tearing a strip from her own shirt to fashion a bandage. "Is it bad?" the nurse asked, her professional calm returning. "I'll live," Eva grunted, her eyes never leaving the landscape ahead. She keyed the emergency frequency on the radio, her voice steady but strained. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Ghost Rider 11. I have 2 souls on board, 1 critical HVT and 1 civilian. I am inbound from the Zermatt Valley, requesting immediate medical evac and a heading to the nearest FOB. I am compromised!" The radio crackled for a heart-stopping moment before a controlled, incredulous voice responded. "Ghost Rider 11, say again. We show you as MIA. Authenticate." Eva gave a code, one that would confirm her identity and instantly flag her for arrest. There was a long pause. "Authenticated, Ghost Rider. Proceed to heading 270. A Black Hawk with escort is scrambling to your position. Be advised. You are to be escorted directly to the FOB. Do you copy?" "I copy," Eva said, her voice flat. The tone said it all. She was not a returning hero. She was a prisoner. The landing at the forward operating base was a surreal spectacle. The little bird, battered and streaked with mud, settled onto the tarmac, surrounded by a cordon of MPs and a waiting medical team. As the rotors wound down, Eva saw Sergeant Miller standing at the edge of the crowd, his face an unreadable stone mask. The medics rushed forward, gently extracting a weeping Dr. Aris and a shaken but resolute Anahita. As they were led away, Anahita turned, her eyes meeting Eva's. She placed a hand over her heart and gave a slow, deep nod. It was a gesture of thanks that transcended language. Then 2 stern-faced military policemen approached the cockpit. "Captain Rostova, you need to come with us, ma'am." Eva unstrapped herself, wincing as she moved her injured arm. She handed over her sidearm without a word and stepped out onto the tarmac. The sun was breaking through the clouds, glinting off the puddles. She was home, and she was under arrest. Weeks later, the scene was entirely different. A sterile, brightly lit conference room at Bagram. Eva stood at attention, her left arm in a sling, her dress uniform feeling like a stranger's skin. Before her stood a 4-star general, his face grave. Flanking him were several high-ranking officers, and to her astonishment, Sergeant Miller, now wearing a formal dress uniform of his own. "Captain Eva Rostova," the general began, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "You are charged with gross insubordination, theft of government property, and conduct unbecoming an officer. The evidence is incontrovertible." He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. "However, the individual you extracted, Dr. Aris, has provided intelligence that has neutralized a significant bioweapon threat. The civilian Anahita has been reunited with her family and is providing invaluable information on enemy networks." The general's eyes softened almost imperceptibly. "Your actions, while in flagrant violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, yielded a strategic victory of the highest order and saved 2 innocent lives." He picked up a small, dark case. "It is the decision of this command with a strong recommendation from the CIA and JSOC that the charges against you are to be dropped. Furthermore, for your extraordinary heroism and valor at the risk of your life, I am proud to present you with the Air Force Cross." He pinned the medal to her chest. The medal was cold against her uniform. There were no cheers, only a respectful silence. The general shook her hand, his grip firm. As he and the other officers filed out, only Miller remained. He walked over to her, looked at the medal, then at her face. He reached into his pocket and placed a small, sewn name tape on the table beside her. It was hers. Rostova. It was stained with mud and a small dark spot of her blood. "We recovered it from the cockpit," he said quietly. "Some of the boys thought you might want it back." He offered a crisp salute, which, after a moment's hesitation, she returned. Then he was gone. Ava stood alone in the silence, her fingers tracing the star on her medal, then the dirty fabric of her name tape. She had won. She had lost. She had saved them. And she had never, for a single second, doubted the cost. The mission was scrubbed. But she had gone back. And in the end, that was all that mattered.